Oh, I meant to grab my my headphones. Is that?
Yeah. And we are the Coalition, loud and proud, outrage porn-free, civilly disobedient media broadcasting live on the Worldwide Coalition Radio Network, well, at coalitionradionetwork.com, facebook.com/the Coalition Radio, on the mighty, mighty Twitter at Coalition_radio, and, of course, the original mothership at coalitionradio.us, where 8 years of interviews, including some guy named Gary Johnson, and if you're local to Rhode Island and New England, somebody called Bob Healy. Well, we've got formative political figures in New England, as well as national libertarian politics, as well as third rail issues. We cover everything that no one wants to talk about. Decriminalization of sex work, legalization of all drugs, immigration, our border with Mexico, and, of course, issues like tonight, where we talk about tariffs. Joining me again, he's kind enough to join us. Hopefully we'll get him back as often as he can stand it, is Eric Baiman. He of Reason Magazine. We provided a link in our pre-show publicity to some of his work, and we'll continue to do so because it's great stuff. He joined us a few weeks ago to talk about a little dust-up he had with the state of Rhode Island when he dared to mention that Governor Gina Raimondo, whose nomination is sort of on semi-hold right now by none other than Ted Cruz, which we just love. Not a big fan of Ted Cruz, but listen, if he can make Gina's life a little more challenging, all the power to him. But he writes covers an astonishing range of economic, political, social, political issues for Reason Magazine. It should be for, anyone, whether you're a libertarian or not, Republican, Democrat, there are places to go where you don't have to rely on what I call press release journalism, where you can actually get independent thought, well argued, highly accessible in terms of printing. This is written like a general consumer magazine, yet they cover some of the most challenging economic concepts of our time. There are places to go where you don't have to rely on the lamestream media. You don't have to rely on the people who are still beating Donald Trump to death, if you will, who are still arguing about whether Hillary Clinton matters or not. Yes, there are places like Reason.com, which, quite frankly, should just be on your list every morning to get up and check out not only Eric's work, but a lot of other great work that's done there. We've mentioned them before. Organizations like AIER, as far as the Goldwater Institute. Quite frankly, what's happening in American media today is a revolution, but not in what you think. The houses of great thought, which we call think tanks, have, through the miracle of the World Wide Web, have developed their own front-facing publications, which they can update efficiently with great original thought. It's up to you to read it and to choose whether you agree with it, or most importantly, use it as part of your reading menu, if you will, every day, so that you can understand a variety of perspectives as they affect the great issues of the day. So Reason.com, it's easy enough to look up Eric's work. Just go up into the search bar, type in Eric, and you can sort it, and you can literally catch up just about every other day or so on what he's written most recently. Eric, today we're going to talk about tariffs. So yes, the coalition is wonk central. Where else could you while away a beautiful Wednesday evening in the midwinter? Some people might be playing darts at their favorite tavern. We can't do that anymore. Some people are binging on Netflix, but we're going to talk tariffs, aren't we?
My favorite topic, Pat. Thanks for having me on.
Absolutely. All right, so I'm going to give you one of these great toss-up questions. Tariffs. Hey, we're going to show the Chinese. Yeah, they're going to respect us. What could possibly be wrong with tariffs? Eric, what could possibly be wrong with tariffs?
Wow. A whole bunch of things. But again, thanks for having me on, Pat. It's always good to be here and talk with you. And you are far too kind about Reason's work, but we really, really appreciate it. And we try to do all those things that you were saying right there. Try to stay away from the press release journalism and the both sides-ism, and try to really get to the heart of some of these issues. Tariffs, I think most people are, I guess, are probably somewhat familiar with them now for the last few years, where President Donald Trump used them somewhat haphazardly in his own pursuit of various trade and foreign policy agenda items. But I mean, at base, they're a tax. What a tariff is a tax that is applied to goods that you import into the country. So we can use aluminum as a great example because Trump and now President Joe Biden have both put tariffs on aluminum from different places. So if you have aluminum that is imported from, say, South Korea or from the United Arab Emirates, it comes into the United States, and whatever the value of that piece of aluminum might be, or the aluminum sheeting, or the raw aluminum that's coming in, you automatically tack on 10% to the value. That 10% just goes. That 10% is paid by the importer. It's paid by the American whatever company, whatever business might be importing the product, the aluminum. And then that 10% tax just goes straight to the U.S. Treasury. It is money that comes out of the pocket of an American business, out of the wallet of an American businessman, and goes straight into the federal government. It doesn't stick it to China. Nobody in a foreign country is paying for this. It's not a situation where we're imposing some higher costs on the production of aluminum somewhere else. No, it is entirely higher costs that are imposed on the importing of aluminum from somewhere else into the United States. And then those higher costs are almost always passed on, and almost entirely passed on down the chain from that point on. So the raw aluminum comes into the country, the tax is applied, the importer then has to sell that aluminum to another business that's going to use it to make interiors of a car, a piece that might go into a car or something like that. And then that higher price is just going to be passed on all the way down the chain. We got a really great kind of real life lesson in the economics of tariffs over the last few years. And people who've studied it, people who've looked at it say that, basically all of the higher costs created by Trump's tariffs were just passed right along to American businesses and to American consumers.
There's an apocryphal tale, if you will, out on the interwebs, and you can tell me whether it's true or not if you're familiar with this. And of course, I'm talking about tariffs on soybeans, which of course devastated the state of Iowa, which of course then led the then President Trump, the Trump administration, responding with, if you will, for lack of a better word, bailouts to the farmers who were affected, which then, of course, we used to pay for with money we borrowed from China.
Yeah.
Is that true?
Well, I mean, so the situation with soybeans is a little more complicated. What happened there is that it wasn't even so much tariffs on soybeans. What happened is we put tariffs on first. So just we back all the way up, I guess. The Trump administration, starting in early 2018, put tariffs on washing machines and solar panels. That was kind of that was like the Lexington and Concord of the trade war. It wasn't really the official part of the trade war yet. It was just sort of the early skirmish. And then the Trump trade wars really got going in March of 2018 when the administration put a 25% tariff on imported steel, 10% tariff on imported aluminum, more or less from all sources. Some of those tariffs got changed and lifted as the years went on. But for the most part, all steel and aluminum imported into the country was subject to those tariffs. And then in the summer of 2018, there were a number of new tariffs. Ultimately, billions of dollars worth of imports from China were subjected to tariffs that hadn't previously been subjected to tariffs. And it was in response to that China decided to cut off almost entirely its purchase of, at least temporarily, they later bought more, but for a while they cut off the purchases of American agricultural goods. One of the things that China is the world's largest consumer of soybeans. The United States is the world's largest grower and exporter of soybeans. So this was a natural sort of pinch point for the Chinese to target when they were unhappy with what we were doing with regard to their goods that were coming into our country. So they stopped buying American soybeans. And the result of that is that there was just a glut of soybeans. America literally produces more soybeans than we could eat. We could not, if you ate nothing but soybeans every day, Pat, we wouldn't be able to consume all the soybeans that we grow in this country. We have to export them, and we do great business selling soybeans around the world. But when China stopped buying our soybeans, they're the number one consumer. There weren't enough other places for the soybeans to go. There was a glut of them. Anybody who studied basic economics knows that means the price falls. When the price falls, that means the farmers take a loss. And that is why eventually the Trump administration kind of stumbled into this idea of, we'll just pay the farmers not to grow the beans that they used to be able to sell to make a profit. And now we'll just pay them out of the treasury money to have these extra soybeans laying around. It's a disastrous kind of spiral of trade policies that the Trump administration put this country through, and farmers in particular over the last few years. And I think now, just to bring it back to what's happening, this week and happening since Biden came into office, it's really disheartening. It's really disappointing to see that a new administration has come in, and they're so far haven't really done much of anything to roll back this mess that the Trump administration made on trade. And in fact, has actually, put new tariffs in one instance on aluminum from the United Arab Emirates. So Biden, I guess, doesn't have much of an interest in unwinding this trade war.
What impact has this trade war had economically on the I'll call it the ham and eggers of the world, the very folks that we're supposedly protecting?
I was actually talking to a guy who runs a business in Ohio. He runs a small scale manufacturing business that's sort of like in the middle of the supply chain. They take aluminum and other raw materials, and they make it into forms that then other businesses use to make other products. So I mean, they're very much like in the middle of this supply chain. Just this week, actually, as I was writing this one story for a reason. None of this got into the story, but he was telling me that they've seen 40% price increases since I think it was since March of 2018. I don't remember exactly the time frame he told me, but 40% price increases. They've got supply chain issues. There are certain types of aluminum that they just can't get or not currently being imported into the country. These at the end of the day, the real consequence of Trump's trade wars and the best, strongest argument for unwinding all of these things as quickly as possible, if you're the Biden White House, is that it just backs everything up. What it's doing, it's not helping American manufacturing. It's not protecting American jobs. What it's doing is it's just making it more difficult. It's putting impediments in the way of businesses that need to buy product so that they can employ people, so that they can make things. This is really, like even before the coronavirus pandemic hit, that's been very bad, obviously, for the economy, very bad for jobs. Even you go back to late 2020, when the rest of the economy was going, not 2020, late 2019, when the rest of the economy was going gangbusters, and the manufacturing sector of the U.S. economy was already in recession then, the last 2 quarters of 2019. And it's hard to find a good explanation for that when everything else was going great, except for the big thing that had changed in 2019 is that it suddenly became much more expensive to import a lot of things into this country from China and from elsewhere around the world that we need in the manufacturing sector to make things, because America makes finished products. We don't make raw materials and basic products anymore. We mostly take things and make finished products out of them, but it just became much more expensive to do that.
Right. One area that I've got some level of expertise is in the automobile industry, and particularly the truck industry. And even on a smaller level, Ford has something called the F-350s, 450s, 550s, and they're shipped as chassis, and they're sent to body companies. They're incomplete units, what they're called, and you'll see them sometimes on a car carrier, and there's no body on the back. They're the damnedest thing to say. Then independent companies manufacture dump bodies, what they call service bodies, platform bodies, all sorts of stuff, so that American industry can work, construction, excavation, countless applications in the trades. And these bodies have gone up. In fact, we just had a surcharge come across, in some cases, $500, $1,000, $1,200 per truck. And folks now go out and try and buy a pickup truck, right? Because we're Americans and we drive pickup trucks. And Ford, of course, obviously makes the finest pickup trucks on the planet. And now you can easily spend over $50,000 for an F-150, because a few years ago, Ford shifted to aluminum. It's safer in a lot of respects. It's more fuel efficient, easier handling. It's a whiter white. It's an improvement in the product on a multiple scale. But now all of a sudden, holy cow, our truck's expensive. And this is why I often say I've seen the enemy and he is us. The Biden administration, I didn't see a lot of talk about tariffs in the election, incredibly enough. Go back to the Clinton administration when it was the economy stupid, right? And now all of a sudden Donald Trump became the issue. Are issues like this often the casualty of the politics of personal destruction?
I mean, yeah, I think that's part of it. There's two sort of competing theories that I have about why we didn't hear much about this during the campaign. The first is that Biden didn't need to say a whole lot in the campaign, right? Because so much of the election last year was just a referendum on Donald Trump, and not even a referendum on his policies, which it could have been. And Biden certainly could have made it a referendum on his policies by saying, "Look, here's all the ways that Trump's tariffs have hurt American businesses, have hurt farmers," and he did some of that. But it was mostly a referendum on Donald Trump's personality. You either liked him or you didn't. You liked his tweets or you didn't. You thought he was crass and vulgar and incapable of being president, or you thought he was a true American hero or something. And that's really all the election came down to. On the other hand, then you also have the reality of what Trump did over the last few years is that he kind of ushered in a lot of policies with regard to trade that Democrats have wanted for years. Democrats were the ones who, for a long time, were the party that stood against free trade, right? For the most part, you had the Senator Bernie Sanders, right? That type of progressive Democrat is the kind that's been railing against NAFTA ever since it was passed. And so you had, I think, there was a sizable element of the Democratic Party on the left that likes to see more tariffs, and in fact wants to see more barriers to trade. And I don't think Joe Biden is that type of Democrat. He hasn't been throughout most of his career. In fact, he was a supporter of NAFTA. He was basically the lead cheerleader in the Obama administration for the construction of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, that trade deal that never actually got off the ground, and then Trump killed it after he came into office. But Biden has been more or less a strong supporter, certainly at least among Democrats, you would describe him as a strong supporter of free trade throughout his career. But he had nothing to gain by alienating the people to his political left by running hard against Trump's tariffs. And I think you see, and you certainly saw during the primaries that candidates like Elizabeth Warren were talking about how Trump, hadn't gone far enough on some of these things. So the Democrats, and now Joe Biden in there, I think he's happy to just sort of leave these policies in place, because rolling them back is only going to anger the labor unions and groups to the political left that Biden needs.
Oh, well, that's refreshing.
Yeah, right. There's so much good news there.
There's so many things rolled into that statement at once, particularly if you happen to be like myself, a big L libertarian, that you just, you just slump over and just wish for sleep, the final sleep, because we have re-engineered our economy into oblivion at this point. As great as some of our ability to rebound from the Rona, if you will, is the stark realization that if you pay attention, how much better off we could be if they just stopped screwing with it, just allowed free trade to take place. Do you? It's hard to predict with the Biden administration, because always remember the Biden administration elected to its transition team a young woman named Cecilia Munoz, who was the architect of family separation under the under the Obamanistas. So right. Go figure on that, right? Who built the cages? Yeah. So, I mean, what do you think going forward? What happens here? Do we see additional tariffs piled on?
I don't know. I wouldn't want to predict the future. I'm not very good at predicting the future. I didn't think Donald Trump would become president. I didn't think Joe Biden would become president if you'd asked me that a year ago. So I venture a guess there. I think one of the really interesting things that we are going to see during the Biden administration is going to be an evolution of the United States' relationship with China in particular. Mm-hmm. And tariffs are not, or at least should not be, a major part of that. Mm-hmm. But I think you will see Biden recognize that there are domestic political benefits to the strong anti-China approach that Trump took politically, and Biden, I think, will also recognize that stepping back and rolling back some of Trump's trade policies, specifically with regard to China, may not be received domestically here in the United States well. They may, it'll be easy for his political opponents to attack him as being weak on China, even though the right thing to do would be to roll back the tariffs on China and to reset with Beijing and say, look, we're gonna take the trade war off the table, but also we're now going to be very upfront about the fact that we don't like what you're doing in Hong Kong. We don't like what you're doing with the Uyghurs, and we think those policies need to change, and we will be more aggressive about making sure they do, even if that involves certain punitive measures taken via trade. So then the question is, what can the Biden administration do on that front if China doesn't back in? And China, clearly is feeling like they can do whatever they want with regard to places like Hong Kong. And so then there are two things you can do. And the first thing that the Biden administration should try to do is they should basically revisit the Trans-Pacific Partnership idea that was nearing completion at the end of the Obama administration. And that even in the very final stages of the Trump administration, you saw the Trump White House come around to this idea of like, oh, it would actually be really useful if we had a coalition of like-minded nations that could all put political pressure on China simultaneously, so that it wasn't just the United States standing up by ourselves and doing it. And yeah, that's exactly what you should do. You should get Japan, you should get South Korea, you should get other countries that are committed in the Pacific region that are committed to free trade and openness and liberal values, and you should have them form some sort of a coalition to oppose China economically if need be. And so that's the first thing that should be done. And then I think the other thing that the Biden administration should do with regard to China is that it should look to places that compete with China and try to give those places economic advantages. This is the inverse of what Trump tried to do, right? Trump's whole theory of the trade war was, we'll put tariffs on goods imported from China, mistakenly thinking that that means China is going to pay for those tariffs, when all it meant was that America was paying for those tariffs. The correct way to approach this is to go to Vietnam, is to go to South Korea, is to go to places that compete with China for low-level manufacturing and say, what we're going to do is we're going to cut tariffs, we're going to cut the obstacles that businesses face in doing manufacturing in those countries. And so that is a way to shift manufacturing out of China, to shift the economies of Asia away from China. It's not going to happen overnight. It's not going to happen. It's not going to make China not be a serious economic superpower in the next 10 years. But it will on the margins, I think. And people who I talk to, people who know who have studied this, say that that's the sort of thing that will make a difference on the margins, that will make China change its behavior, hopefully, or at the very least will give American businesses alternatives that they don't currently have.
To me, one of the underestimated, undervalued, if you will, benefits of life in the United States and or its impact on the economy in the last few years has been how inexpensive it has been to buy goods from overseas for the American marketplace. And currency issues obviously play a role in that. But is that a fair statement? I mean, to what impact do you believe that inexpensive goods have had on the quality of life in the United States and the ability of American businesses to see significant improvements in efficiencies?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that I have any statistics off the top of my head to point to there.
A gut reaction, though.
I think free trade is good. Like I think the evidence overwhelmingly of the last let's say just 30 years during the NAFTA era, for example, it has been it's an economic winner. I think too often or not, this is like the famous Bastiat thing, right? About the seen and the unseen, right? That I think most libertarians are somewhat familiar with. The story of, if somebody breaks a window and, you see the economic activity that goes on when the window gets replaced, but you don't necessarily see the types of things that might have been done if the guy didn't have to fix his window. I think that is often the case in these debates over free trade, right? We see the shuttered factory and we see the factory workers that get laid off. We don't necessarily always see, the other jobs that they might get. We don't always see the benefits of trade that exist just in the things that we have in our house, the things we can buy that our parents or grandparents couldn't afford or literally just couldn't even have. And so I think that's the issue with free trade, is that it's a difficult sell in that sense, because the negatives are sometimes so obvious, but it's actually not a difficult sell, because when they do polling on these things, Pew has, or Gallup, I think it is, something like 70% of Americans are in favor of free trade, think favorably of free trade. It polls better than any president we've had in recent history. It polls way better than Congress. And yet we've got two successive administrations that seem to think there's some sort of political victory to be had with protectionism, even though I think most Americans realize that trade is actually, it's been good for this country and it will continue to be good for this country.
Right. I mean, are Americans really willing to give up their $400, 122-inch flat TV when given the challenge, if you will, of increased price? I mean, I go back generations to when Walmart made its first forays outside of the greater Arkansas area, and you were faced with that challenge of the displaced downtown greengrocer slash hard goods store, the little department store. When in fact the reality was, as much as upset as Americans were about that displacement and the loss of that business downtown, they were very quick to drive in 20 miles to Walmart to get milk at half the price and virtually anything else, particularly in communities that have been historically underserved, that weren't going to see that variety of goods and services in an easily accessible big box retail format. Right, and so now project that on forward, and somehow populism means, the elimination or the handicapping of free trade directly at the expense of the very people arguing for it. Is that an educational issue, or is it just people being swept up in the emotion of the what some folks would refer to as Cult 45?
Well, I think the excuse me. I think the emotion of it is obviously a big part of populist politics all the time, right? But I think I think it has to do more with just to take it back to protectionism and manufacturing for a second. Trump promised that we were going to have protectionism for the American aluminum industry and the steel industry and American manufacturing and all of that. Did a bunch of things that he thought were going to help those industries. And then when you look at, again, you have to kind of take out the last year because COVID threw a rock in the pond and messed up all the statistics kind of. But before that, I mean, the sectors of the American economy that were struggling were the manufacturing sector. You had steel mills that were laying off people and closing. You had an aluminum plant in upstate New York that shut down. There was a steel plant in Western Pennsylvania late in 2019 that was shutting down, laying off a bunch of people. And the CEO of the plant said, "This is because of the tariffs. Like, they're not helping us. They're actually hurting us. Right. It's not like the protectionism isn't good because it's driving up the price of the raw materials that we need to make the finished steel products that we produce and sell. And it's now too expensive for us to do that. And the companies that we used to sell to are now going, and buying from Canada or buying from somewhere else where they can get these finished steel products cheaper because they don't have to pay the tariffs." And so it didn't work, right? Like, the protectionism actually hurt the very sectors of the economy that it was supposed to be helping. And we see that play out over and over again. Bush tried the same thing. Bush tried tariffs on steel back in, 2003 or 2004. It didn't work then. It doesn't work. Tariffs are not a successful strategy in a globalized economy where goods are always moving across national borders and where you can go somewhere else and get the thing you want if the price goes up in one place. And that's all tariffs do. They just raise the price here. I think the secondary point to make on that is that the other thing that Trump occasionally and some of his supporters would sometimes write to me about or tweet at me about, like, "Oh, Donald Trump just wants radical free trade. That's what he's actually after here. He wants everybody to lower the tariffs." I don't think there was ever any evidence that that's what he was actually after, but that's the right thing to do, right? Like, that's exactly the right place to go, would be to try and move not just this country, but move other countries of the world towards a situation where you have lower tariffs across the board. And that is what free trade agreements do, warts and all. They're government deals that are not necessarily libertarian at their core by any means, because they're all negotiated by governments and they're telling businesses what you can and can't import or export with certain prices and tariffs and quotas and all of that. But overwhelmingly, when you look at the 50 years or 80 years, whatever it is, history since World War II of free trade agreements around the world, what we've seen is a steady and consistent decline in tariff rates across the board. And that is good for economies. It's good for the global economy, and it's good for all the little individual economies that make up the global economy.
Because in closing, here's the ultimate irony, been a long day. When a manufacturer of a specific product that's hit by a tariff, or someone who is able to, if you will, mine a particular ore, a particular metal that's hit by a tariff, when in fact the price, let's just say they're the domestic producer, when the price is raised artificially on their foreign competition by a tariff to then be higher than the domestic manufacturer or the domestic miner of said product, what is almost always their first step? Isn't it to simply raise the price that they're selling their product for so that it nearly matches that of the tariff product? And so isn't that, in a sense, defeating the purpose as it was intended towards the American consumer public?
Yeah, you see that absolutely. And we did see that again because Trump gave us a terrific real life experiment in all of this. We saw the price of American hot and cold rolled steel both shot up within the first couple of months after the tariffs were placed back in 2018. And then what happens after the price goes up is you start to see the people who are buying those products, not just here in America, but around the world, start to shift where they're buying from. They're going to go to the lower prices. And so then what happened and what ultimately hurt steel mills in this country over the last few years is that they lost buyers because it was now suddenly much more expensive to buy American steel. But you could go, you could go to Canada, you could go to somewhere else and get finished steel for a lower price. And so then that's the thing. First, the price went up, the buyers left, and then the price cratered because nobody wanted to buy from American steel. And then you had layoffs and things like that. So unsuccessful policy. I think the other really important thing to talk about here that we haven't talked about is that, and this is really relevant to the Biden administration coming in, is that what you had for the last 4 years with Trump is you had him kind of consistently expanding the ability of the executive to unilaterally set trade and tariff policy, right? And he did not come up with this out of the blue. Most of what Trump was doing was using two different provisions that have been in federal law for years. But one of them in particular, the Trade Expansion Act of 1962, has a Section 232 in it, not to be confused with Section 230, which we hear a lot about these days too. Section 230, good and important. Section 232, bad. And Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act of 1962 says that the president can, for national security reasons, sort of route around Congress and unilaterally impose tariffs. And Trump used that, I would say abused that part of federal law to place these tariffs on steel and on aluminum. The Trump administration for a long time kicked around the idea of placing tariffs on foreign-made cars under the premise that they were somehow a national security threat, which was actually just a bridge too far even for Trump. Even Peter Navarro and Donald Trump couldn't be convinced to take that dive to try to tell the American public that your BMW is a national security threat. But this whole idea that like imported aluminum is somehow a threat to American national security is just completely fabricated. It's vacuous. Trump never tried to defend this. None of his people ever really tried to defend this argument on the merits. It was just sort of the legal rationale. It was like a checkbox they had to check so they could put these tariffs on. They said, yeah, national security threat, put the tariffs in place. But then whenever Trump talked about the tariffs or tweeted about the tariffs, he never made the point that imported steel was somehow a threat to American national security. No, he said he wanted leverage to make deals, or he wanted to punish the Chinese or whatever, right? He was very upfront about that. And you see the same thing now from the Biden administration. They're using this exact same argument. They're using Section 232. Trump expanded the ability of the executive, or expanded the norm that the executive can use this more or less whenever they want. And now you see Biden doing this with the UAE tariffs that he put in place a few weeks ago, the 10% tariffs on aluminum from the UAE. Same sort of thing. The rationale, the official legal rationale there is national security issue. And if you go and read Biden's executive order, it says we're doing this because this imported aluminum is a national security problem. But then when you go and his press secretary, Jen Psaki, got asked about this at one of the White House press conferences, and she said that it's about, we're reevaluating our trade policies with people around the world, and that we want to make sure we're, not just changing the Trump administration's trade policies without giving it due diligence or whatever. She never once said the words national security. She never even attempted to justify these, because it's not. And everybody knows it's not, that it's just a made up excuse to put tariffs on things. But this is what happens: is you have a presidency and a chief executive a chief executive from one party that comes in and does something, sort of breaks a norm. And then when you have the other party come in and do the same thing, it just establishes and entrenches that as the new norm. And that is the real problem here, is that we're now going to have two consecutive administrations that have used the Trade Expansion Act of 1962 to basically say that the president can put any tariff on any good he wants at any time, as long as he checks the box that says, yeah, this is a national security issue, even when it's clearly not.
Right. And before we segue into the article that you wrote about welfare, Mitt Romney and Joe Biden, I just want you to expand upon that for a second, because in the recent history of American politics, we have been norm breaking left and right. And I ain't talking about the guy from Cheers, right? We have been taking these time-honored traditions and disposing of them as if they were yesterday's trash. And up until about 10 years ago, there was, quote unquote, unspoken rules. And in the effort to become populists and describing these unspoken rules, whether it be how a bill was considered, how it was voted on it, what percentage of the vote was necessary, the nuclear option, that the term nuclear option is now being applied to about 30 different areas. Every time one side of the duopoly, it doesn't even matter which it was, a Democrat or Republican, unseats these norms, chaos ensues, because they've given carte blanche, if you will, to the other side, the other laundry. Because that's right. Seinfeld says, we're just rooting for laundry, right? So what we've done here is, by destroying these norms under the excuse of it being the swamp, or whichever cliche your side chooses to employ, we've really, really screwed up, haven't we? Because
that's exactly why. That's exactly why, and I argued over and over again during the Trump years, that's why it was important for Congress to draw a line with Trump and to say, no, you can't just scream the words national security and that gets whatever you want to happen. But that's kind of the place where we are now, is where the president can just say, oh, national security, and that means I can put tariffs on whatever I want, on imported cars or on steel or aluminum. And Congress should have taken a harder line with Trump. There were some Republicans in Congress who did want to take a harder line with Trump. There weren't enough of them. And now you've got a situation where the Democrats control Congress. They're not going to take a hard line with Biden on this either. So you're going to be left with, exactly what we just said, which is you're going to have two successive administrations expanding the understanding of how this law can be used, even though we're now pretty far afield from the intention of it. And it's just going to be so much more difficult to roll back if it can be rolled back.
And my point is, it's not just this one rule; it's every rule, every norm that they destroyed. And
yeah, sure. You see this. Yeah, you see this in other areas too, for sure.
I mean, one need only look to a certain Supreme Court justice who was never heard, who's now, karma's a pretty quick turnaround in the new millennium. For me, I'm old enough to remember when karma took about 20 years. Now I think we're down to about 22 days in terms of payback. Or there's a now deceased legendary New England politician. His name was Vincent A. Buddy Cianci. He was the longest serving mayor in America. And perhaps his most famous quote, not issued in polite society, however, was, "Don't step on the foot today that's connected to the ass you'll have to kiss tomorrow." And no truer words, I believe, have ever been said in American politics. Got a few minutes left. Eric Baiman is joining us. He's with Reason Magazine. And by the way, this is a perfect example. When I look to different authors at Reason, it's easy enough for me to search on them and then rejigger it by date, or you can go to what's called the latest, which is in the upper left-hand corner of the navigation panel, and literally it's the latest articles have been written. You've got this cast of writers, and they're all writers. They're, because somehow in America we misconstrue press releases for writing. These are folks who actually construct paragraphs and bury the lead, and do all these things that writers do. They actually paid attention in high school and then refined their craft by writing, not just the difference between me and you is my version of writing, I do a mean Control C. All right, that's all. I can drag and drop with the best of them, but you actually write things. But what's astonishing, if you go down this list of the latest articles: media criticism, sports, vaccines, Justin Amash, impeachment, welfare, meat, coronavirus, drug war, Reason Roundup, space, fusionism, brickbats, socialism, sex crimes, impeachment, public schools. That's the scroll of the first 10 articles, if you will, on the latest section of Reason magazine. That's astonishing to think of, that there are enough writers who can cover this much ground on so many different issues, and at the same point, make them so accessible that is the real value here. And by the way, you can subscribe to the written publication, and are you ready for this? You can actually donate to Reason Magazine, and there's a handy-dandy link right on the top page, because this ain't free. I just want to throw that out there. But you wrote an article that managed to, in one article, tie together the esteemed Mr. Romney and Joe Biden, because one need never forget that they all get along really well when they're not in front of a microphone, don't they? But talk to me about kids and government and thousands of years and circumstances. Talk to me about that.
Yeah, that's right. So one of the big things that's being kicked around in Congress right now is this debate over, well, it's part of a bigger debate over the COVID relief bill that the president has proposed. One element of that could be a kind of rejiggering of the way the federal government runs some of its biggest welfare programs, and in particular, kind of a reworking of the child tax credit that anybody out there who has kids is probably taken advantage of. So there's actually two kind of competing, but actually rather similar ideas, one from President Joe Biden and one from Senator Mitt Romney on this, that would, in both cases, do away with the child tax credit and replace it with direct payments to families, to parents of children. And again, the numbers and the specifics are there on the site. You can read the article about that. But basically what this breaks down to is that you would get about $3,000 per kid per year. And that would be distributed in checks that would actually come once a month, not just one big lump sum per year. It is larger than the current child tax credit is capped at $2,000. It's a refundable tax credit. You can actually get up to $1,400 of that $2,000, even if you pay no taxes. If you pay at least $2,000 in taxes, you can get all of that back. This would be about $3,000 a year, and it would be, again, not administered through the tax code, but run through the Social Security Administration, actually, in Senator Romney's case. And one of the big disagreements here, one of the big sort of divides between the two proposals is who would qualify for this. The president's plan would max out with individual parents who earn about $75,000 annually, or couples who earn $150,000 annually, and then it would slowly phase out once you get above that level of income. Senator Romney's plan would go all the way up to couples that make $400,000 or individuals that make $200,000, effectively covering most Americans except the richest Americans. And again, it would be the same amount of money, that full $3,000 per child per year, capped at a total of $15,000. Annually. So a lot of numbers there. It's a very wonky kind of thing, but this would be basically an attempt at just changing the way the welfare system operates. Instead of running it through the tax code, we'd be running it more through direct payments, which from a libertarian point of view, I think is actually an idea worth considering. Although, with the very important caveat that the federal government shouldn't, at the end of the day, be incentivizing people to reproduce or have children, and certainly shouldn't be doing that for people who can't afford to have kids. If you can't afford to have kids, don't have kids. But if the government is going to do this, and it clearly is, then I think that you can make the argument that the government has a responsibility to taxpayers to do it the most efficient way possible. And I think there's something to be heard from, at least here in Romney and Biden's ideas.
Or we could get really crazy and stop taking so much and leave the money in the economy to stay with. Don't want to get nutty here. But then again,
that would be my preference, obviously.
But as we refer to him here on the Coalition Talk Radio, Willard Mitt Romney, or AKA Mittens, is the guy who did bring socialized health care and I'm painting with a broad brush, obviously, to People's Republic of Massachusetts, and as a result, now to Soviet Workers' Paradise of Rhode Island. Which, thank you, Willard.
It is kind of funny to think that Mitt Romney, right, once Republican presidential candidate, is in some ways on the forefront of some of these progressive policy issues. Like, this is an idea. This child allowance idea is really an idea that's really percolated on the center left in recent years, more so than anything else. History is politics is weird sometimes, man.
Again, if you're a big L libertarian, or even a small L libertarian, you've come to acknowledge that the Republican Party is just kind of nastier version of what I'll call mainstream socialism at this point. Let's think about how we've spent the last hour, Eric. We've talked about a Republican Party that's promoted tariffs, then promoted income redistribution to blunt the impact of the tariffs domestically, and then we've talked about ways to modernize, not replace, not reimagine, to a degree, if you will. Notice the things that you pointed out nonetheless, in order to enact even a higher level potentially of transfer payments, which is income redistribution. I think you and I have had this conversation about 10 times over the years, but what happened to the Republican Party? And is it finally time for them to join the Whigs? That's the great unanswered questions. The challenge for the Big L movement, of course, is that while thousands upon thousands of Americans, at least anecdotally, in some case proven, are abandoning the Republican Party as we speak. I think, under the category of I think in the last 7 minutes, statistically, I think 1,100 Republicans have just bailed. The challenge for myself, admittedly as a big L libertarian, is to what opportunity there is for us to grow. And the problem is that despite their overt disgust with these policies, tacitly most of them support them. And it's really taken Trump to pull them out. But the problem for us is, are Republicans ready to embrace economic literacy? Are they ready to embrace the implications of being pro-life on the criminal justice system? Are they ready to embrace real, meaningful immigration reform, not just, playing with the numbers of how many categories like pickup sticks in order to, meet the demands of the news cycle? That's the real question, whether or not these people will go anywhere, or will they slink back to that whatever Trumpian hole they came from eventually, once their outrage du jour has been settled. Don't know if that's a little bit too dark, but it's. I've got.
I do want to be, if we have a minute, I do want to be fair to Romney on one thing though.
Yeah, please. Go ahead.
Unlike President Biden's child allowance plan, what Senator Romney's proposing is actually, and he says is fully offset within the budget. Because what he would do, obviously there would be these huge payments that would go out to families and parents of children, but this would eliminate the TAMF program, temporary assistance for needy families. He would completely get rid of that. He would eliminate permanently the SALT deduction, the state and local tax deduction. He would change the way the earned income tax credit works, which is another tax credit kind of similar to the child tax credit that helps out needy families and poor families, working class families. And so he would basically roll up a lot of those existing welfare programs and funnel the money into these direct payments, which again, and you can have the sort of principled argument about, well, the government really shouldn't be doing any of these things. And I'm with you on that. I'm there. But if the government is going to do these things, I think what Senator Romney's proposing is an alternative to the existing kind of tangle of various, sometimes confusing, often difficult, and for the poorest people, difficult to access. Because if you don't pay any taxes, some of these tax credit programs don't help you at all. So he's proposing to replace that with an offset, the same amount of money, but just send the money to people and let them decide how it should be used. And I think from a libertarian perspective, there's something to be said for that. So I do want to at least give him credit for that. We'll see whether those offsets stay in place or not, because Congress has a habit of eliminating the how to pay for something once they pass the bill. But at least in theory, it's there.
And the points you just made sum up our conversations very neatly, because you routinely interject, whether it be Gina Raimondo and our relationship with the taxpayers, or in this case, transfer payments. You routinely, very neatly, very intelligently interject a sense of reality into, old libertarian warrior here who still yearns for the day of me walking into a house with gold and paying for things. It's and to that point, you're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. I will be that guy that holds out hope for, again, libertarian utopia. But at the same token, we've got to acknowledge that where there's opportunities to interject sense into these these craven schemes that we've got right now, which are filled with Harry Potter-esque dark alleys and dark arts, if you will, of accounting magic, that shining the light and crushing maybe perhaps a few of the twists and turns aren't a bad thing in reality. Yeah. I'm just hoping that my fellow members of the Libertarian Party Radical Caucus aren't listening right now, because I'll be drummed out at dawn. But to your point, it seems Willard does make the good point from time to time, and he did have the, as we say here, the cojones to vote to impeach, and it's always interesting to me when he ran for president. Despite all the things he did that could be considered moderate, and there's an object lesson here for anyone who's running against a Democrat, they will mistake your kindness for weakness, and no matter what you do, which may be good for the very constituency that they seem to clatter for, they will still hate you. They're still going to make remarks about how many women in files or whatever it was that they've got. So, wow. Great stuff. What are you working on these days? What do we got coming up? Is anything you can give us a sneak peek at, a little bit of a tease?
Well, I don't want to give anything away yet, but I will just say this: it's been refreshing the last few weeks to be able to write about policy in a deep way. Like, for example, today I spent a number of hours on this piece about the various benefits and consequences and potential repercussions of changing the way our welfare system for needy families works, right? Like, that's a thing that there was just no oxygen for much of the last 4 years. Mm-hmm. And Donald Trump was good for a lot of things in politics, I think, and offered a bit of reset on the way we think about politics in some ways. But just from a pure media environment perspective, there was no oxygen in the room for any of these kinds of detailed discussions. And it's kind of nice. I think maybe I won't feel so much that way in 6 months, but at least for now, it's a little bit refreshing to be able to have that sort of thing in the forefront again.
No, you're right. The field of battle has certainly moved from the emotional now to what we call here on the show, our show is Wonk Central, where we embrace, we just, before you were on, we spent an hour talking about urban transportation policy and bonding as it impacted that, as opposed to the same old. So you're in the right place spiritually. We could spend an hour talking about 2 hours, maybe even talking about both 230 and 232, possibly moving into the same conversation. And quite frankly, we need to, whether it be the liberty movement at large, needs to get away from, if you will, the emotional, because I fear, particularly in the Republican side of the aisle, it certainly changed that, and the Libertarians were even getting tempted by that, and move towards, the wonk side of the aisle, where we use truths and economics and, if you will, the science of money, right? Science. We all love science. Use that as a way, as the prism with which we analyze government policy going forward. Corporatist Democrats are quite different animals, if you will, than progressives, and I fear that the liberty movement is obsessed with progressives and willing to let corporatist Democrats kind of have their way because they seem like they're kind of like us, but they're not. And I will just close up at this point. I'd love your opinion on this. It is still my contention that the greatest challenges we face in terms of turning into a planned economy, in terms of redistribution, in terms of corporate monoliths, oligarchs, whatever, it comes from the Gina Raimondos of the world, from the corporatist Democrats of the world, and our fear of the progressives is far too driven by emotion as opposed to reality. We can close off on that. What do you think about that? Oh, on that note, I think we lost Eric. Wow. What a tease to the end of the show. Well, let's close off on that then. We are the Coalition, loud and proud, outrage porn free, civilly disobedient media broadcasting live on the worldwide Coalition Radio Network at coalitionradionetwork.com, facebook.com/the Coalition Radio, on the mighty, mighty Twitter at Coalition_radio, and of course the mothership at coalitionradio.us. It's been a hell of a night. We'll be back tomorrow, Thursday evening, with another round of programming, including, hopefully, the reappearance of Shane Hazel. He'll be back on the show. Have a great night. We'll see you then.